Hey everybody, Weem here. Today I want to talk about how I start a campaign. This is actually a question I get asked here and there, how I go about starting up a brand new campaign. I see it asked online a lot as well, so I thought I would dedicate this video to talking a bit about that. Now there's kind of two main approaches to this. There's a lot of different ways you could work on a campaign, including a combination of these two, but typically people talk about a top-down approach, and that's kind of, I call it like a zoomed out approach. It's kind of starting at the top, let's say gods and planets and things like that, and working your way down to the smaller details, cities and people, right? Start from the top, work your way down. The other, of course, is the reverse of that, the bottom-up approach, which is where, say, you start with a starting town and some NPCs and things like that, and then you expand the world over the course of play. This is actually the approach I prefer the most. For a variety of reasons, and so that's what this video is really going to focus on because we're talking about my approach to starting a campaign specifically. It's kind of interesting today. Roll20 threw out a tweet asking people what advice would they give to newbies when it comes to planning or running games for the very first time, and he simply responded, "Start small, period." And it was funny because this topic has been on my mind. I knew I was going to be making this video, and I was like, wow, I'm going to be going home today recording this video. And that was just a perfect, kind of thing, perfect response, I guess, to this kind of topic in my mind. So anyway, I thought I would kind of throw out a little shout out to Newbie DM there. So when it comes to starting a campaign, really you've got to look at what your goals are for the world, right? That'll determine whether you build from the bottom up or top down or some other way. You've kind of got goals, and these different approaches can meet them in different ways. For example, if I just felt like, which I do sometimes, feel like fleshing out an entire world just because that sounds fun to me with gods and everything, and that's my goal, is just to make a world, a fully fleshed out world, then I really do like the idea of kind of a top-down approach where I'm the only one really giving input into the world. But my goal in starting new campaigns, I've actually got a number of goals, and so let me cover those really quick. One of the first goals is to establish why my characters are together. Why are they starting together when we start the game? Now, you don't need to have a bottom-up approach here, but I do find that that is easiest for me. The reason for that is because I can start with just a town and kind of have the players there and find very easy ways to connect them. And as they talk about their character backgrounds, I can start to kind of visualize the area, say, outside of the town, for example. And I can really start to work that in, and use that to start to connect why these characters are together through asking questions, some leading questions. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But anyway, that's one of the goals there, is to establish why characters are together. The next one for me is I want to connect each of the characters to something or some things in the world, like people, places, stuff like that. And I also find that that's much easier with this approach. The third goal for me is to demonstrate the world-building authority that I want to give them. And what that means is that I want them to be able to come up with answers to the questions I'm about to pose them, where they are telling me about the world, where they're making a decision. That's hard for a lot of players. If they say, hey, where I came from, how common are dwarves in that area? If I then say, well, I don't know, you tell me. Are there, a lot of dwarves you think nearby, or like the elves that this group, the civilization that you belong to, are they pretty separated from that stuff? And asking that question back to a player, a lot of players kind of freeze up, like, oh, I didn't know I could have that kind of input. So my main goal, or one of, again, the main goals here in the bottom-up approach, is I can actually show them how that works very early on, get them involved in that very early on, and that kind of demonstrates the authority that they have in world building, and then we could carry that forward as we play. That could be a little bit harder in a pre-established world, because if I ask a question of a player and they may say, oh, well, XYZ, I don't want to have to say, well, in this world it doesn't really work like that. How about this instead? They don't really have as much authority there. The fourth goal I have here is that I want to present them with an opportunity to break the ice and get to know each other, right? When I'm starting a campaign, And this really goes, to any campaign or any first session is I want there to be opportunities for the characters to get to know each other. Oftentimes that actually happens in the very first session as they play, right? But not necessarily before play. We talk about characters kind of connecting with each other, maybe in what's called a session 0. I'll talk about that in a minute. But where kind of, I know you because of this, or, I think we probably know each other because of that. When I do this kind of approach to world building and things are pretty open, it's a lot easier for players to kind of take that control and say, well, as a ranger, I've probably explored these woods, so I think it'd be cool if I did this. And that means that you and I, mage, we've probably worked together, or wizard, I suppose. It's easier to kind of have that kind of control there in the beginning and connect to other players, I find anyway. So those are kind of the main goals I have when I'm starting up a campaign brand new right from the beginning. I mentioned session 0 a minute ago, and some of you will know what that is, and some of you may have never heard that before. So I'm going to explain that for those of you who are not quite sure what that means. When we talk about starting up a campaign, or multiple D&D sessions are going to happen in a row as part of a campaign. Typically, you have your first session, your second session. Well, session 0 is basically the concept there is let's get together as if we're going to play, but really let's just make characters and talk about the world, get to know each other, and then maybe the next time we get together we'll actually start, aka session 1. So that's kind of what a session 0 is typically meant to do. Now for me, I tend to kind of combine the two. I tend to say, hey, let's do a session 0, you guys. We'll get together, we'll make characters. You guys will be able to, connect with each other, connect with the world. We'll come up with some of the elements in the world. We'll work together to kind of build what we need to get started. But we typically have enough time when I'm starting up campaigns that we actually get to play a little bit, which I like to do. It's kind of a warm-up session. Okay, you've made your characters, you know a little bit about the world. Now let's do something a little bit fun. We do a little bit of RP and maybe like one encounter, something that we have a little bit of time for towards the end. So people are kind of loosened up a little bit so that when we have a full play session, that kind of early stuff is a little bit out of the way. Now, when I spoke earlier about the kind of my 4 main goals, I think 3 of them are pretty self-explanatory, establishing why characters are together, connecting them to things in the world, and presenting them with an opportunity to break the ice to kind of get to know each other. Of the 4, the third one that I've skipped over is the one that in which I said, I want to demonstrate the world building authority. I kind of want to get into that specifically because I also mentioned asking questions of the player. And I'm going to cover that right now because that's kind of the sketchy one for some people. The other stuff pretty much makes sense, but the world building authority and giving that to players, that one is it's a little harder for people to kind of grasp onto. So I thought I would kind of get into that a little bit. And this really comes down to the asking of questions. And this is something I really picked up from Dungeon World a while back when I first got into it. It just kind of blew me away reading through how the game worked, reading some actual play stuff, and then in playing it myself and everything. And I really bring this into my D&D. So the questioning of the players, basically asking questions and using the answers, is key for me in this setup. So when we get together, and I'll kind of walk you through some examples here, because I think examples are a really good way to kind of comprehend what's going on there and why it works for me. Basically, when we get together and the characters or the players are making their characters and everything, I really like to ask these questions. And there's different kinds of questions. We can ask leading questions, or you can use multiple choice or really open-ended stuff. And it kind of depends. The type of question I ask kind of depends on what I'm going for. If you think about a normal, say normal quote-unquote D&D game where you are the DM and you're running the DM, you're kind of dictating things to the players. You're like, this is what the forest is like, and here is what is in the forest and everything. But if you ask questions and allow players to kind of give some feedback and help build that, you really get their buy-in and you can connect them to the world. But it can also be overwhelming. You have to be cautious of that. Some players are like, what do you mean I have to tell you what's dangerous in the woods? That doesn't really make sense. And so that's where kind of the type of question you use can be important. So one of the ones that we talk about here is leading questions. And that's basically where you're kind of setting someone up, kind of guiding them in a direction you think makes the most sense, but it still leaves some room for them to, perhaps say no, or maybe if they're creative and ready for this kind of challenge, they can actually offer something up and say, well, that's cool, but what about this? And then I can say, oh, that's cool. That's great. So for example, using the danger, in the woods example, this is actually something I did in Dungeon World. I asked the ranger at the time, they were in the woods, and I asked the ranger, I said, you've probably, as a ranger, you've probably been through these woods before. And there is something a little bit, there's a danger in these woods, something that people should be looking out for. What would that be? What might that be? And so this is a very open-ended question. It's not really a leading question, but the point is to kind of show you how this kind of went. And basically, he said he was a little bit unsure, and he said, well, probably there's goblins that like hang out by the river. And he kind of said it with a question, mark at the end there. And to which I kind of looked around the group and I said, river goblins, they are super dangerous and they're everywhere. So I just took his response, and that was fact. That was now part of the world. And in fact, on the map, I wrote river goblins in that area. And the other players, all of them very new to Dungeon World, some of them even new to tabletop RPGs, were kind of like, oh, that's really cool. And they kind of got it, right? And so that's kind of what we're getting at with the questions here. So with leading questions, you can get, and say things like, in that situation, a more leading question might be, there are threats in the woods here. Some people believe them to be goblins, but they move very fast and tend to stay in the dark. Ranger, you may have seen these before. Are these goblins, or are they some, other creature that can be mistaken for a goblin, something like that. And then you're allowing them to have that, the response that's not going to get too outside of the scope of you leaving it wide open. They may be stumped, but you're kind of leading them in a direction. They may say, oh, well, I don't actually think it's goblins at all, but, kobolds are kind of smaller. Maybe they're mistaken for that, but there is this different kind of kobold. Or, there is room for them to say no, but otherwise you are kind of guiding them in a direction. You can see where this is going to go when I talk about, say, multiple choice kinds of questions. One of the things you could do is, I'm going to use the ranger again. And I really like to use these, by the way. You might be wondering, well, when do you ask these? I ask these when I want to know something about the world, and I'm pretty open about, what could be there. Like, it doesn't matter too much to me, or I don't have something I already have in mind. Or if there's, for example, like a slow moment in the game, somebody's looking something up. I love those opportunities. Somebody says, oh, well, let me look that up in the book. I might turn to, say, the ranger and say, hey, so what do you think about, where you guys are at right now? You've been traveling along this road, and you know what? The road actually takes a split here in the mountains. Do you think you should take the high road that could be faster and probably safer? Or you could take a lower path that follows the river, which is nicer. You might be able to kind of scavenge for food a little bit better there, but there could also be goblins in that area. What do you think? As the ranger, what do you suggest? Right? And then you're not only giving them that input you're giving them that world building authority, right? By them saying, yes, that's a dangerous thing and we're okay with going there. Or they could even give you a different answer. But at the same time, you're also really highlighting that they are the expert of their class, which a lot of people, including myself as a player, we love to know that we're playing a role that's important and is unique from everyone else. And so I really like to use these questions to distinguish people's classes for them, to really help give them a spotlight in a sense. Oftentimes when we talk about giving players a spotlight, we often think about that happening in combat. This encounter is going to really highlight the cleric because there's going to be undead, so he'll have his chance to shine. No pun intended there with radiant things, but you get the idea. So I asked the ranger because he's the expert and he decides, and the players are likely to go with that. If he says, well, I think we should go the lower route. There are goblins there, but I can scavenge for food better. The players go, hey, you're the ranger. And that gives them that sense of authority. You know what I mean? They're the ranger. They do know. They do know best. And then, of course, you can actually, the other type of question I kind of mentioned before was very open-ended. That can be very hard. But if you have some players who are creative and have shown or played in this type of environment enough where they start to feel comfortable, you can ask very open-ended questions. The things like I mentioned at the very beginning, what's here, essentially? Or are there dwarves nearby? I don't know. Have you seen dwarves here before? And people do pick up on this pretty quickly. I actually have a player who, when I first was doing this, he was feeling very stumped. He's like, I can't think of anything. I really don't know. But he really latched onto it. After just a number of sessions, I could go to him and he could come up with stuff, pretty quickly. And sometimes people can't come up with that stuff right away, but that's fine. Give them a chance to think about it. And if they seem a little unsure or you think something may not quite make sense, you can still work with them and say, well, that sounds cool, but also you do know, X, Y, Z. So maybe it could be that, or I don't know. What do you think? Maybe it's something else. So you can work with them, and then that becomes part of the world. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it at that. I covered the various approaches to starting out a campaign, or at least the approaches that I consider to be the main ones. My main goal is when I'm starting a campaign and how session 0 plays an important role in that. Talked a bit about the shared world building with the players and how you can facilitate with asking questions and using their answers. And I think we'll go ahead and wrap that as part of what we'll call part 1 here. And in the next video, we'll call part 2, I want to kind of walk through an example of putting these things together, a town, NPC, some points of interest, and some example questions and everything, and how we can use the answers to those to tie players to different aspects of the world, to points of interest or civilizations or the town or various NPCs, things like that, and how that helps get the game started before it even begins. So anyway, thanks as always for watching. I hope you guys stick around for part 2, and I will catch you next time.